from Scotland's most feared gang leader to world-renowned sculptor, all through the power of art. Jimmy Boyle's hands once destroyed lives, then they learned to create beauty. This transformation will challenge everything you believe about redemption and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible prisoner transformation stories. Professional portrait of Jimmy Boyle, rugged 30-year-old Scottish man with intense eyes, weathered face showing years of violence, strong calloused hands, orange prison uniform, transformation from beast to artist visible in expression, realistic photography, text overlay space for Jimmy Boyle, the Beast of Glasgow. Professional portrait of Sarah Trevelyan, compassionate middle-aged art therapist. Kind, intelligent eyes, holding art supplies, warm, encouraging smile. Prison workshop background. Realistic photography. Text overlay space for Sarah Trevelyan, art therapist. Professional portrait of Patrick Boyle, rough working-class Scottish man in his 40s, weathered alcoholic appearance, vacant eyes, worn factory clothes, Glasgow tenement background, realistic photography, text overlay space for Patrick Boyle, violent father. Professional portrait of Governor Henderson, distinguished middle-aged prison administrator in uniform, progressive visionary expression, prison office background, realistic photography, text overlay space for Governor Henderson, prison reformer. Some prisoners disappear behind bars, but some discover themselves. Jimmy Boyle was Scotland's most dangerous man, a brutal gang leader who terrorized Glasgow. Then they gave him clay instead of weapons, and everything changed. Glasgow, Scotland, 1944. The city was scarred by war, poverty, and industrial decay. In the notorious Gorbals district, where violence was as common as rain and hope was as rare as sunshine, James Jimmy Boyle was born into a world that would shape him into one of Scotland's most feared criminals. The Gorbals was a maze of overcrowded tenements, where families of 8 or more crammed into single rooms without running water or proper sanitation. Jimmy's father, Patrick Boyle, was an alcoholic laborer who drifted between jobs and jail cells. His mother, Sarah, struggled to feed her children on welfare payments that never stretched far enough. Violence wasn't just accepted in their household. It was the primary language of communication. Jimmy learned early that survival meant being harder, meaner, and more ruthless than everyone around him. By age 6, he was stealing food from local shops. By 8, he was running errands for older criminals in exchange for protection and pocket money. By 10, he had been arrested for the first time, charged with theft and vandalism. School offered no refuge from the chaos of his home life. Jimmy was intelligent but angry, constantly fighting with classmates and teachers. He saw education as irrelevant to his reality. What good were books when you needed fists to survive? By age 14, he had dropped out entirely, choosing the streets as his classroom and violence as his curriculum. Jimmy's teenage years were a blur of escalating criminal activity. He graduated from petty theft to burglary, from vandalism to assault. He became the leader of a gang that controlled several blocks of the Gorbals, collecting protection money from local businesses and settling disputes with knives and fists rather than words. The first time Jimmy killed someone, he was 17 years old. The victim was a rival gang member who had been encroaching on Jimmy's territory. The fight started over a perceived slight, something about respect and reputation that seemed monumentally important at the time, but would later seem tragically meaningless. Jimmy stabbed the young man in an alley behind a pub, watched him bleed to death on the dirty pavement, and walked away feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction that he had proven his dominance. The murder established Jimmy's reputation as someone not to be crossed, Other criminals gave him a wide berth. Police added his name to their most wanted lists. Local newspapers began referring to him as the Beast of the Gorbals, a nickname that Jimmy wore like a badge of honor. But the killing also changed something fundamental inside Jimmy. The act of taking a life had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Violence became not just a tool, but an addiction, a way of feeling powerful in a world that had made him feel powerless since birth. Over the next decade, Jimmy's criminal empire expanded beyond the Gorbals. He was involved in armed robberies that netted thousands of pounds, protection rackets that terrorized entire neighborhoods, and acts of violence so brutal that even hardened criminals were shocked by their severity. He surrounded himself with a crew of equally vicious men who followed his orders without question and feared his temper more than they feared the police. Jimmy's reputation grew with each crime. He was credited with numerous murders, though police could never gather enough evidence to prosecute. He survived multiple assassination attempts by rival gangs, each time responding with even more vicious retaliation. By his late 20s, Jimmy Boyle was considered the most dangerous man in Scotland, a walking weapon who left destruction in his wake wherever he went. The lifestyle took its toll in ways Jimmy didn't fully recognize at the time. He trusted no one, slept with weapons within reach, and lived in constant expectation of betrayal or attack. He consumed massive amounts of alcohol to numb the paranoia and rage that consumed him, but the substances only made his violent tendencies worse. Jimmy's personal relationships were casualties of his criminal lifestyle. He had fathered several children with different women, but his presence in their lives was sporadic and often destructive. He was incapable of expressing love or affection in healthy ways. The only emotions he understood were anger, fear, and the temporary satisfaction that came from inflicting pain on others. The end of Jimmy's criminal career came in 1967 when he was finally arrested and charged with murder. The victim was a police informant who had been providing information about Jimmy's operations to investigators. Jimmy had discovered the betrayal and responded with characteristic brutality, torturing and killing the man in a way designed to send a message to other potential informants. This time, however, police had witnesses, physical evidence, and testimony from accomplices who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Jimmy's network of fear and loyalty finally cracked under the pressure of a determined investigation. The trial was a media sensation. Jimmy sat in the dock wearing a suit that couldn't disguise his menacing presence, staring down witnesses and occasionally erupting in violent outbursts that had to be controlled by court security. He showed no remorse for his actions and no respect for the legal process that was determining his fate. When the guilty verdict was read, Jimmy's only response was a cold smile. He had expected this outcome and had already resigned himself to spending the rest of his life in prison. At age 23, James Boyle was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. Jimmy entered Peterhead Prison in Aberdeen in 1967 as inmate number 2469. Peterhead was Scotland's most secure facility, designed to house the country's most dangerous criminals in conditions that prioritize security over rehabilitation. The prison was a fortress of gray stone and steel, where violence was routine and hope was systematically crushed. Jimmy's early years at Peterhead were exactly what everyone expected. He immediately established himself as the most feared prisoner in the facility, using violence to climb the informal hierarchy that governed inmate society. He attacked guards who tried to discipline him, organized riots that resulted in millions of pounds in property damage, and spent months at a time in solitary confinement as punishment for his continued defiance. The other inmates gave Jimmy a wide berth. Even hardened killers and career criminals recognized that he operated by different rules, that his capacity for violence seemed unlimited, and his willingness to use it was absolute. Guards requested transfers rather than work shifts that required them to interact with him. Prison administrators labeled him as irredeemably dangerous and focused solely on containing him rather than attempting any form of rehabilitation. For 5 years, Jimmy lived up to every expectation of who he was supposed to be. He was the monster that society had created, the beast that everyone feared, the irredeemable criminal who proved that some people were simply born evil. The system treated him as such, and he responded by becoming exactly what they expected. But in 1972, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of Jimmy's life forever. The Scottish prison system was under pressure from human rights advocates who argued that the conditions in facilities like Peterhead were inhumane and counterproductive. A pilot program was established to test alternative approaches to managing violent prisoners. Methods that focused on addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior rather than simply containing it. Jimmy was selected for transfer to the Barlinnie Special Unit, an experimental facility attached to Barlinnie Prison in Glasgow. The special unit housed only a handful of the most difficult prisoners, but it operated under radically different principles than traditional maximum security facilities. Instead of isolation and punishment, the special unit emphasized personal responsibility and self-expression. Inmates were given choices about how to spend their time, encouraged to explore their interests and talents, and treated as individuals capable of change rather than as irredeemable monsters. Jimmy's initial response to the special unit was predictably hostile. He saw the progressive approach as weakness and attempted to exploit what he perceived as lax security. He threatened staff members, destroyed property, and tried to establish the same patterns of dominance that had worked for him at Peterhead. But the staff at the special unit didn't respond to Jimmy's provocations in the ways he expected. Instead of meeting violence with violence, they maintained calm professionalism. Instead of isolating him as punishment, they engaged him in conversations about his behavior and its consequences. Instead of treating him as a monster, they spoke to him as if he were a human being capable of making different choices. The approach was initially infuriating to Jimmy. He had built his identity around being feared and hated, and he didn't know how to respond to people who refused to play those roles. For months, he continued testing boundaries and trying to provoke reactions that would confirm his worldview about human nature and power dynamics. The breakthrough came when a visiting art therapist named Sarah Trevelyan offered to work with Jimmy on a sculpture project. Jimmy's first response was contemptuous laughter. Art was for weaklings, intellectuals, and people who lived in a completely different world than the one he had inhabited. The idea of a violent criminal like him creating something beautiful or meaningful seemed absurd. But Sarah persisted with gentle patience. She didn't pressure Jimmy to participate or make grand claims about art's transformative power. She simply made the materials available and let him know that she would be in the workshop if he decided he was curious enough to try. For weeks, Jimmy ignored the invitation, but gradually his curiosity began to overcome his resistance. He found himself walking past the art workshop and glancing inside at the other inmates who were painting, sculpting, and drawing. He watched them work with an intensity and focus that he had previously seen only during acts of violence. Finally, on a gray afternoon in March 1973, Jimmy walked into the art workshop and asked Sarah to show him how clay worked. His first attempts at sculpture were crude and clumsy. Jimmy's hands, which had been so precise when wielding weapons, seemed awkward and uncertain when working with artistic materials. He became frustrated quickly and nearly abandoned the project after his first session. But something about the tactile experience of shaping clay spoke to him in ways he didn't initially understand. There was something meditative about the process of molding formless material into recognizable shapes. For the first time in his adult life, Jimmy was creating something rather than destroying it. Sarah encouraged Jimmy to explore whatever images or emotions came to him through the clay. She didn't judge his early work or try to impose artistic techniques or theories on his natural impulses. She simply provided guidance when he asked for it and praised the effort he was making to express himself through art. Jimmy's early sculptures were dark and violent, twisted figures that seemed to emerge from nightmares, faces contorted with rage and pain, abstract forms that suggested chaos and destruction. But even these disturbing images represented a fundamental shift in how Jimmy was processing his emotions and experiences. Instead of acting out his anger through violence against other people, he was channeling it into clay that could absorb and contain his rage without being hurt by it. Instead of suppressing the trauma and pain that had shaped his life, he was giving those experiences physical form that he could examine, manipulate, and ultimately transform. As months passed, Jimmy's dedication to sculpture became almost obsessive. He spent every available hour in the art workshop, working on increasingly ambitious projects. His technical skills improved rapidly, but more importantly, his emotional relationship to the work deepened. Jimmy began to see his sculptures as conversations with parts of himself that he had never acknowledged or explored. The clay became a medium through which he could examine his childhood trauma, his relationships with violence, and his feelings about the life he had lived and the person he had become. The transformation wasn't immediate or linear. Jimmy still had episodes of rage and violence, still struggled with the patterns of thinking and behavior that had defined him for decades. But the art provided him with an alternative outlet for those impulses and gradually a different way of understanding himself and his place in the world. Other inmates and staff members began to notice changes in Jimmy's behavior. He was still intimidating and potentially dangerous, but he was no longer constantly looking for fights or opportunities to assert dominance. He began engaging in conversations that weren't based on threats or manipulation. He started showing genuine interest in other people's experiences and perspectives. Most remarkably, Jimmy began to express genuine remorse for the violence he had committed and the pain he had caused. This wasn't the calculated manipulation that prison officials had learned to expect from him, but authentic emotional processing of the consequences of his actions. The art therapy sessions with Sarah became opportunities for Jimmy to explore not just his technical skills as a sculptor, but his understanding of human nature, morality, and the possibility of redemption. These conversations were often difficult and sometimes painful, as Jimmy confronted aspects of his personality and history that he had spent decades avoiding. "Jimmy," Sarah said during one session, "what do you see when you look at this sculpture you've made?" Jimmy stared at the piece he had been working on, a figure of a man with his hands covering his face in what could have been shame, grief, or desperation. "I see myself," Jimmy said quietly. "I see all the things I never wanted to admit about who I am and what I've done." Sarah nodded. "And how does it feel to see those things?" Jimmy was quiet for a long time before answering. "It hurts," he said finally. "But it also feels like Like maybe I don't have to keep carrying all of this alone anymore. Word of Jimmy's transformation began to spread beyond the special unit. Art critics and gallery owners heard about the violent criminal who was creating remarkable sculptures in prison. Journalists wrote articles about the experimental rehabilitation program that was producing unexpected results. Jimmy's first public exhibition was held in 1975 at a gallery in Edinburgh. The show featured a dozen of his sculptures, ranging from his early dark and violent pieces to more recent works that explored themes of redemption, transformation, and human connection. The exhibition was controversial. Many people objected to celebrating the artistic work of a convicted murderer, arguing that it glorified criminality and disrespected the victims of his crimes. But others saw Jimmy's sculptures as powerful testimony to the possibility of human change and the redemptive power of creative expression. Jimmy himself was conflicted about the public attention. Part of him was proud of the recognition his work was receiving and the proof it provided that he was capable of creating something meaningful. But he was also aware that his artistic success was built on a foundation of violence and destruction that could never be undone. "I can't bring back the people I killed," Jimmy wrote in his journal during this period. "I can't undo the pain I caused or the fear I created. But maybe I can use whatever time I have left to create something that adds beauty to the world instead of taking it away." Jimmy's artistic development continued throughout the 1970s. His sculptures became more sophisticated and emotionally complex, exploring themes of violence, redemption, family, and the human capacity for both creation and destruction. He began writing as well, producing poems and eventually a memoir that provided insight into the mind of someone who had lived on both sides of the law. The memoir, titled A Sense of Freedom, was published in 1977 while Jimmy was still incarcerated. The book was a brutally honest account of his criminal career and his gradual transformation through art and self-reflection. It became a bestseller and further established Jimmy as a unique voice in discussions about crime, punishment, and rehabilitation. "I was born into violence," Jimmy wrote in the book's conclusion. "I lived by violence for most of my life. I thought violence was the only language I could speak and the only way I could make myself heard in the world. Art taught me that there are other languages of beauty, compassion, and connection. I may never be forgiven for the person I was, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to become someone different." Jimmy was released from prison in 1982 after serving 15 years of his life sentence. His parole was controversial. Many people believed that someone with his history of violence could never truly change and should never be released back into society. But Jimmy's behavior during his final years of incarceration had demonstrated a genuine transformation. He had become a mentor to younger prisoners, helping them explore alternatives to violence and criminality. His artwork had evolved from personal therapy into social commentary that addressed issues of poverty, addiction, and systemic inequality. Upon his release, Jimmy faced the challenge of building a legitimate life in a society that remembered him as one of Scotland's most feared criminals. He was stigmatized by his past, struggled with the practical challenges of finding housing and employment, and dealt with ongoing skepticism about whether his transformation was genuine. Jimmy channeled these challenges into his artistic work. His post-prison sculptures explored themes of redemption, second chances, and the difficulty of escaping one's past. He established a studio in Edinburgh and continued producing work that was exhibited in galleries throughout the UK and internationally. More importantly, Jimmy became an advocate for prison reform and alternative approaches to criminal justice. He spoke at conferences, worked with young people at risk of entering criminal careers, and supported programs that provided artistic and educational opportunities for incarcerated individuals. The system that created me was based on punishment and revenge, Jimmy said during a 1990 speech at a criminology conference. It succeeded in making me more violent, more angry, and more dangerous. The system that transformed me was based on respect, opportunity, and the belief that people can change. That system saved not just my life, but the lives of everyone I might have harmed if I had remained the person I was. Jimmy's later life was dedicated to proving that his transformation was permanent and meaningful. He married Sarah Trevelyan, the art therapist who had first introduced him to sculpture, and they worked together on programs that brought artistic expression to marginalized communities. He wrote several more books, including works of fiction that drew on his experiences but moved beyond autobiography to explore broader themes of human nature and social justice. His sculptures evolved to encompass a wider range of subjects and emotions, demonstrating artistic growth that paralleled his personal development. Jimmy also worked with victims' rights organizations, acknowledging the pain his crimes had caused and supporting efforts to help people heal from trauma and violence. These were difficult and sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but Jimmy felt obligated to face the full consequences of his actions rather than simply celebrating his own transformation. Redemption isn't about forgetting the past or being forgiven by everyone you've hurt, Jimmy reflected in a 2000 interview. It's about taking full responsibility for who you were and dedicating your life to becoming someone different. It's about using whatever gifts or opportunities you have to repair some small part of the damage you've done to the world. Jimmy Boyle continued working as an artist, writer, and advocate until his death in 2021 at the age of 77. His sculptures are now displayed in major galleries and museums throughout the world. His books are considered important contributions to literature about crime, punishment, and human transformation. More significantly, Jimmy's story has influenced criminal justice policy and practice in numerous countries. The principles that guided his transformation, treating prisoners with dignity, providing opportunities for creative expression, and believing in the possibility of change, have been incorporated into rehabilitation programs worldwide. The Barlini Special Unit, where Jimmy's transformation began, became a model for similar programs in other countries. Research has consistently shown that approaches based on respect, opportunity, and personal responsibility are more effective at reducing recidivism than traditional punishment-based methods. Jimmy's life story challenges comfortable assumptions about good and evil, punishment and redemption, the possibility of change, and the permanence of identity. He was genuinely one of Scotland's most dangerous criminals, responsible for terrible acts of violence that destroyed lives and traumatized communities. But he was also proof that even the most damaged and destructive people can find ways to heal, grow, and contribute positively to society. "I spent the first half of my life destroying everything I touched," Jimmy wrote in his final journal entry found after his death. "I've spent the second half trying to create something beautiful enough to balance the scales. I'll never succeed completely, but the attempt has made my life worth living." The clay that Jimmy first touched in that prison art workshop in 1973 had absorbed more than just the pressure of his hands. It had absorbed his rage, his pain, his guilt, and his desperate hope for redemption. In shaping it into art, he had learned to shape himself into someone he could live with. Jimmy Boyle's transformation from Scotland's most feared criminal into an internationally recognized artist and advocate proves that human beings are capable of profound change at any stage of life. His story offers hope to anyone who feels trapped by their past and demonstrates that even the darkest chapters of a life can be followed by redemption. The sculptures remain, long after their creator is gone, silent testimony to the possibility that hands trained for violence can learn to create beauty, and that hearts hardened by cruelty can learn to embrace compassion. In the end, perhaps that's the most powerful art of all.